Hi, and welcome back to the Mob Mentality Show. I'm Chris Lucian, and my co-host is Austin Chadwick. And today we are going to continue our Habits of Highly Effective Mobs series. And this one is Habit 6, Synergize. To me, I think this one might be the most mob-like habit. So maybe Austin, maybe you can dive into the topic and we can start talking about it.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And as he says in the book, um, each habit builds off the earlier habits. And I think it's definitely the case with this one, Synergize, and the last one, Sharpen the Saw, where you are really building off the previous habits, being proactive, begin with the end in mind, putting first things first, think win-win, seek first to understand, then to be understood. And now you're kind of putting it into action with this Synergize one. And to kind of go straight from the book content to maybe our thoughts and experiences. The book has Synergize in a paraphrase kind of way, saying, and I think this is why Chris called it like the most mobbish one, valuing differences, seeking ways to combine strengths to reach a more significant outcome than any one person could achieve alone. So yeah, it's straight up. It reminds me of that. What was that GIF Llewellyn and Falco made where it's got like the different individual lines and they're
Yeah.
up and down, and then you combine them all together, and then you get something higher, right?
If I work alone, you get my best and my worst. But
Yes.
if if we work as a group, then you get our best at any one point, right?
Yep. Totally. Totally. Yeah. 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 Exactly. And I think, so obviously this book was made before mobbing. And I think it's speaking more generally than specifically mobbing. But this, in my mind, is one of the main essential things you're trying to do as mob. I mean, you're trying to turn up the good on flow efficiency. You're having all the brilliant minds come together. But yes, you have the whole system in the room, so you have the different pieces of the puzzle that can all fit together to amplify each other. And then it's just putting it into practice, right? So you're valuing differences, you're creating a third alternative, you're listening to understand, which is one of those previous um, habits. You're being open to feedback, and you're building relationships with trust and respect, which, haha, what was one of the foundational virtues in the first mob? Was it
And
kindness?
kindness, consideration, and respect. Yeah,
Yes,
that
yes,
was
yes,
one of
exactly.
our. I think that was our at the end of our first retrospective after mobbing. Was just
Nice.
continue to treat each other with kindness, consideration, and respect. It was good.
Yep, yeah, for sure. And I think before diving into some of my experiences with this, I will note what's funny about the kind of semantic diffusion of this word is in pop culture. I can think of a movie and a sitcom where they talk about synergy, and the guy in the suit puts his two hands together and talks about synergy. It's funny, it really had nothing to do with what he's talking about here. It was more about like two companies manipulating their customers so both of them make money or something.
Yeah.
And so it's just funny to see how a word starts out with a certain meaning and then it comes to mean something else in pop culture. And I think it's quite funny. Um, but yeah, so I mean, in my experiences, yeah, this has been like my mobbing experience from day one, right? You don't go into a mob to value what I'm bringing. You coming into it to value the differences, right? So
Yeah.
when I mob with you, Chris, I am, my goal is to value what you bring, so usually it's a different approach to solving the problem. Like I've noticed whenever we mob together, my go-to design patterns or refactorings aren't yours, but I learn a lot from seeing yours, right? That kind of thing. And so instead of
Yeah.
seeing that as a problem, you're valuing that difference, right?
And likewise as well. And I think often we come to a point where we've incorporated bits and pieces from each path, right? And
Yes.
yeah, and
Yes.
and I think that's what they mean by like the 1 + 1 = 1.5 at least, I think was one of the quotes. And or yeah, 2.5 or something.
Yeah.
But the yeah, you get these refined solutions, this multi-pass refinement that is really interesting, and it happens during mobbing, but and I think in the book it's often referred to as collaboration, but there are also other opportunities for synergy, even independently working working with like-minded destinations or something along those lines. So, those sorts of things, but at least exchanging information and then using that to to improve the result by capitalizing on all of the new knowledge that you gain from each other, right?
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And I think you and I went through this recently, right? Where it was a very difficult problem, and I think everyone in the room was coming at it from a different angle with a different opinion,
Yeah,
quite passionately. And if you go, and so I think this is, I think a theme recently for me is, and it was a recent previous episode that we released, is like what mobbing is not.
yeah,
And I think if you are coming into a mob without this synergy perspective, you're probably not using the word directly, where you're valuing the differences and you're listening to understand, it's almost set up for failure, right? I guess mobbing or collaboration in general, because the only outcome is that your thing wins and the other, it's the win-lose kind of thing, right? Which is a lose-lose. Um, and so I think the 1 + 1 will probably equal 1, or, -1, or
yeah,
1.5 or something, where you're like, you're defeating the contributions of other people, right? That really in the end make it better. So yeah, and I think if I've ever been frustrated in a mob, I think at core there is a flaw in my personality where I'm seeking my idea to win or something.
sure, yeah,
And that helps unearth that. And it's kind of like, why am I frustrated right now? Well, my idea is not being, it's not being, it's not what they're doing. But it's like, well, is the point to just have my idea be done? So yeah.
yeah. Well, and I think I think a lot of people. I have heard this, pretty frequently, where it's like you go into a mob and it almost becomes contentious or it does become contentious because it's like you need to do my thing. And what I like to think about and what I encourage people to do often is kind of yes and improv. And so, in improv exercises, you kind of have to, the show Whose Line Is It Anyway, does a lot of this
That's
where you can't just go back and overwrite what the last person said if you're doing a collaborative story. You have to be shocked by what was said, and then you have to then make it make sense within your own narrative. And so when somebody says like, and your mother was a chicken, and then you say, and yeah, and it was really odd eating all that chicken feed as a kid, right? Because you have to make the narrative continue working. And so I view a lot of like synergy and collaboration, like so then the audience thinks it's really funny. And therefore, these two unrelated stories now have joined together, and they're both way more funny than they would have been apart.
mhm,
Because now, and that's how the 1 + 1 equals, 2.5 or more.
right.
Um, and so I feel like practicing yes and improv in a mobbing setting is also really good. It's like, hey, you want to do that security thing, and I want to do this refactoring over here. And you have the structure of like red, green refactor and only refactoring when green to kind of
Yeah.
keep pace, right? Because also comedic timing is also really important. So I think there's a lot of synergy between mobbing and yes and improv exercises, as well. But yeah, I like that idea because and then it also keeps everything very light because there is this adoption and iteration on ideas. But also, there's positive synergies in this like other model of everyone draws, right? So when you're making a big architectural decision and somebody's architecture is going to win, I think it's often really good to have everybody draw their own picture independently of what they think the architecture should be, and then reveal them all at the same time, right?
Yeah.
Some people would have had the same ideas here, some people would have different ideas there, but then you discuss the differences. And this is also why I like the Three Little Pigs retrospective, because when you're highlighting differences to create synergy, it's like oh, our security is actually a straw house. It'll just fall right over. And but like this other person's like, our security is a brick house because we've implemented this like crazy thing. And it's like maybe one person is not aligning it or doesn't realize. And so talking
Yes.
about that difference is really important. Not that like if everybody's like straw house for everything, then you have other problems. But you don't want to talk where everybody agrees. You want to talk about where everybody disagrees. So yes, and improv for like forward
Yeah.
movement, and then like highlighting of disagreements um and also visualizing those disagreements can be really helpful when trying to come to a really good solution.
Totally, totally. And I think I used to struggle philosophically with yes and in certain contexts. And I think over the last couple of years, I think I have a model where yes and works because yes and's really clear when they're not contradictory ideas, right?
Yeah,
Right. Or at least not apparently contradictory, right? So it's kind of like, oh, you want to do infrastructure as code and I want to do refactoring. You can do both, right? Like
yeah,
there's no. And so that's an easier yes and. The yes and I've struggled to learn is when it is a competing idea, right? Where someone says, hey, I'm going to delete the implementation and rewrite it. And my idea is let's extend it or something, right?
yeah,
As opposed to. And so what I've learned the way to yes and that situation is like, this is the wonderful thing with code. And I think this is what's so maybe it's not an accident that mobbing was born, at least in this style with code, is because experimentation is pretty fast, right? And so in other contexts, um, thinking very broadly now, sometimes it's harder to run an experiment, right?
yeah, yeah,
But with code, it's usually pretty quick. So one example earlier this week was someone had an idea. It was kind of out of context. So we wrote it down. We finished the thing we were coming on, and we came back to it. And the way they want to implement this idea was basically delete the existing implementation and then start rewriting. And at first, I was tempted to be like, this is going to be a problem, but I'm just like, all right, let's do it. Let's see what happens. So making the yes and be like, yes, do your thing, but let's make it small with fast feedback and safe, right?
yeah,
And
yeah,
and then what would happen is either it works, they rewrite it and everything works perfectly, or they rewrite it and I'm like, okay, let's run the tests. Oh, and 20 failed tests. Okay, so and so the yes and leads to maybe a negation of something that was previously suggested, but it was learned together as opposed to me shooting it down before the start of it, right? And so
It reminds me of a story from the really early days of mobbing.
yeah.
Uh, there was like we were looking at a legacy code base, and there are all these like fancy refactoring tools, all the JetBrains stuff. And so, one person proposed, let's just run all the automated refactorings on everything. And
Yeah.
another developer who was not used to the tools at all was like, kind of about to have a heart attack. So they were like completely, disagreeing thing.
Yeah.
But then, and this kind of goes back to the seek win-win chapter, but it was like, hey, well, we have source control. Let's just check it in, and then let's run all the refactorings and run the program. And then if it fails right away, we know what's going on. So, the result surprised everyone because like we ran all the refactorings and uh, and it failed, even though they were supposed to be safe refactorings. And the reason it failed was because there were functions being run by their name, and so the names never got refactored in the strings. And so it was a very enlightening experience for everyone. But what was really cool about that moment was that so one person was about to, I mean, both people were about to dig in hard on their point of view. But uh, but doing both, we ended up with like a really, or at least just running the experiment and then evaluating both solutions
Yes.
afterwards,
Yes.
ended up being a really great way to both learn something new about the code base and continue on the other path. So in
Nice.
my mind, that was like a good yes and experience.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And there are rare cases where one idea, so to speak, wins.
Yeah,
But it's funny how it surprises me every time that I think it's in the high 90s of percentage where the thing we end up doing has pros from either of the two initial ideas, right? And so
yeah,
they both make it in there. because even failed experiments, you learn things from that start leaking into other ideas, right? And
Yeah.
so, yeah, and I think, that's part of listening to understand is like, especially as developers, you can hear what someone's saying, but to actually see it implemented helps you understand on a deeper level, right? So being open to do it is part of the synergy of listening to understand. Um, and with that, I love this. Being open to feedback without involving your ego. Yeah. um, yeah, and I think getting your identity out of your idea is something that I feel like mobbing does a lot of often.
Yeah.
So, you get it almost becomes it turns from uncomfortable to entertaining to see how many of my ideas are wrong. Get proven wrong throughout a week of mobbing. And but yeah, you want to be open to that feedback, right? Whether it's feedback from another person or from the experiment results that you're learning together. Yeah. And so I don't know, anything else to add on this one before we wrap it up?
Yeah, I mean, in that example of learning things from your mistakes faster than you would have otherwise, Lee, I think that's part of you know, the uh, positive reinforcement math there, the 1 + 1 = 2.5, because you are, uh, you know, I think that working collaboratively in this way accelerates learning so much that you end up, creating a net benefit that is, in the long term unheard of when doing solo work. So,
Yeah. And I think maybe the one last thing I'll add is I think in the book I was talking about building relationships with trust and respect. And what's cool about synergizing or mobbing is that I feel like it's maybe I'm butchering the terminology, but like a self-reinforcing feedback loop.
yep.
Like I extend trust and respect and I yes and someone else's idea, and then they reciprocate it back and forth. And then trust and respect grows. And the more you do it, trust and respect grows. And so it's like yeah, and maybe that's where the 1 + 1 = infinity after a certain point, because it just keeps growing stronger and stronger by the act of doing it itself without needing a external stimulant of trust and respect. It's
Yeah.
not like, I better get along with Chris outside of the mob because in the mob we're just going to hurt our relationship more and more, and trust and respect will grow lower. You know what I mean? Kind of thing. So that when it's done well, working through the disagreement, finding the third alternative, yes, anding builds trust and respect. I think that was in the 5 Dysfunctions of a Team book too. I think the way he put it was, uh, the amount of conflict you want in your team is like right before that edge where people are hurt, right? So it's like a
Yeah.
little uncomfortable, because when you overcome that, your trust grows higher, right? Where if the conflict, like if you hold back your opinion and keep the conflict lower, it actually doesn't build up trust and respect as much as working through some stuff, right? And so, but you don't want to push it too far where, you know, Chris and I's trust and respect grew because we called each other's names and have overcome it,
Yeah.
or something.
Yeah.
So, yeah, cool. Well, yeah, please like and subscribe. Please reach out to feedback on LinkedIn, YouTube, and more. Where have you seen synergy or attempts at synergy go well? Where have you seen it not go not so well? Please share with us. We'd love to hear. And until next time, mob on and have a good one, everybody. See ya.
Bye, everyone.